And thank you for the opportunity to contribute to the roundtable in this way. I've been asked to talk about the user perspective and my experience with MaaS actually started out in a very practical way in a pilot, the UbiGo pilot in Gothenburg. And although I'm a researcher, our work here, or most of our work here in Gothenburg, is embedded in actually working with developing and evaluating services. So it's very practically oriented research. And it's been very rich environment to research in. So as I was told that I should expect that you've all done your homework and read the paper. I hope that's true because there's a lot of material in it. So I know some of it I'll cover in the presentation, some I won't. There's too much to cover in 20 minutes. But anyway, to quote one of a project partner in one of our MaaS pilot projects, this was a lot harder than we expected. So I'm going to try to kind of paint the bigger picture with this first discussion paper, not only talking about the user perspective, but also how that fits into the bigger picture and just why this is more complicated or harder than we had expected. So one aspect of why is because we're kind of stuck in an uncertainty loop where uncertainty leads to more uncertainty. There's a lot of looming questions, some of which have already been brought up. Can this contribute to more sustainable behavior, etc.? So this means that especially public actors, but even private actors can be very reluctant to join services or to support MaaS services. So what does this mean? Well, that it means that there are fewer pilots and implementations out there, which means if they're evaluated, hopefully they're evaluated at all, a lot of them aren't. But that leads to data being limited, which leads to limited chances to evaluate the data or the pilot, and limited conclusions as to the effects, which leads to more uncertainty. So we're kind of stuck in this loop right now, which isn't good. Hopefully we can start getting out of it. But another reason it's a lot harder than a lot of people have expected was, I think in part, that people have underestimated the complexities. Again, thinking about that transport is a system. We're working in a system. It's not the typical siloed thinking that a lot of people have had. So in underestimating this complexity, things have gone a lot slower, and a lot of this is linked to a lack of practical experience. I think a lot of times there's an eager but naive technology-driven approach, kind of the if you build it, they will come approach, where I get a lot of questions that basically boil down to two things. Who are the customers? Which modes should we combine, and what should the bundle look like? Basically this idea like, okay, we just have to overlay an app onto a certain number of modes. We find the, supposedly customer segment, say young millennials or whatever, and then we've got it. Well, it's not quite that simple. And really we need to be taking a more systematic approach, looking at not only the user, but the system, but thinking of the user in a bigger societal context. For example, you don't just have a user using transport. The user is embedded in their own context, such as a family or household. And connected to that, you have all kinds of constraints on your action or your abilities. You have your financial resources, what modes you own, your cognitive and physical abilities, knowledge and habits and stress, identity and values, competing needs within the family or household, etc. So that just makes it complicated in and of itself. But then attached to that, you have, of course, the geographical context, where you're living. For example, is it an urban area, a rural area? What kind of infrastructure is there? What kind of access do you have to different modes? What are your costs of living? What's the weather like? etc. Then you have a societal or / legal regulatory context that also creates boundaries or conditions. For example, what are the overall trends and norms? What are the taxation policies? What are other transportation related policies like parking, congestion charging, and what are, say, the urban planning and land use policies where you live? And then you've got, on top of that, if you're thinking about the MaaS service in particular, or what is the service offer that you could potentially even use, tied to their organizational context, you have the design of the actual service. But then in the organizational side, you have just business models in general and the perceived opportunities of these companies or public or private actors. You have how they interpret regulations, they have their own organizational goals, they have their own experiences or issues surrounding collaboration, etc. So it's actually a very complicated context. And then you have to try to figure out, okay, does this service actually even match with my or my family's needs, the perceived match? So one way you can look at this is a framework, an analytical framework that we developed in the IRIMS project on a way of identifying institutional factors, enablers, and barriers affecting MaaS development and implementation. It's kind of just a way of showing everything I just showed you. And here we've split it up onto 3 main levels: micro, which is the users; the meso, which is kind of the local and organizational level, where the operational level, where you have the local regional governments and the public and private service providers, etc. And then you have kind of the macro level, which is maybe the national government or even supranational governments. And then covering it all, you have the society at large with trends and norms, etc. And when you understand it in this way and you identify where enablers and barriers are on these various levels and how they interact, then you really start to understand how the development of MaaS really requires changes at many levels, both within and between different organizations, not just individual change. And it is, as already mentioned, there are a lot of perspectives represented by the people participating in this roundtable. And it can be hard to understand each other's perspectives, even the language we use in our different areas of work and our own priorities. And this is also true within MaaS, in achieving MaaS. It's about trying to somehow align these perspectives, the user, business, and societal perspectives, trying to maximize matches, minimize the mismatches, and identify their gaps, and also trying to discuss the trade-offs, which trade-offs are acceptable, and who should decide over this. And just some examples. So it's about developing MaaS services and offers that meet users' needs and add value while also promoting societal goals. At least this is the vision, or some people's vision. Above and beyond the goal of actually delivering MaaS, in the paper I talk about how there's actually not a customer. Everybody or every household has slightly different situation and slightly different needs, and different types of services can be better or worse matches for those needs. And we're going to have to try to figure out most likely a spectrum of services to cover all these needs. It's not necessarily going to all these needs are not necessarily going to be met by one service. And then just, you know, the idea of sustainability was already brought up in the introduction. But again, this is another big challenge. How do we do this? We have people with very different conditions. For example, on the first line, we have people who primarily walk and bike and have very low transportation costs. Now, these people are already acting fairly sustainably compared to a lot of other people. So what's the service offer? What service can we offer that covers their needs, but also, for example, as a societal goal, avoids inducing demands for less sustainable modes? How do we make sure these people basically stay sustainable? Then there's other types of users with completely different needs. You have, say, multimodals who use cars semi-frequently, or people looking to access cars without trying to purchase it. And that's our societal goal. How can we keep people who don't have cars from purchasing cars, from perceiving the need to purchase a car? That might be a very different service offer from the previous one. And you have kind of the opposite. You're also looking to offset car ownership, but from the other direction. You have households, say, for example, looking to downsize or economize. How can you provide a service, you know, covering their needs that also reduces the number of private cars that are necessary so that these people will sell their secondary or primary cars? And then you might have households with very limited or no access to a public offer. I mean, a lot of the experience thus far and the rhetoric around MaaS has been basically urban MaaS, an urban version of MaaS. I mean, there are projects looking at, say, rural MaaS and other MaaS geared towards other types of customers, and there are more pilots coming. But, you know, this will remain to be seen. How can this be achieved? So if you have a situation with limited or no access to a public offer, how can you improve access to the nearest public offer and or, say, increase sharing services? If it's not feasible with public offer, maybe you're going to have to look towards more peer-to-peer services. But then in general, for everybody, for all of society, how are we going to try to improve occupancy and utilization rates, increase sharing, shift towards more sustainable modes? And really, there needs to be a broader, I think, broader thinking around the different types of services and the different types of offers to meet these different needs and different challenges, different societal goals. And then a bit more about users specifically. I think it's important to think about adopting this innovation. In this case, you're adopting a service, trying to learn how to use a new service, and you might be also adopting new behaviors. So it's really kind of a dual innovation in the case of MaaS. But this is all a process, and it's a process that's very easily disrupted, and really users need a lot more support throughout this process than they're given. And I would just like to point out that many innovations need to undergo an innovation process as well, just as a side note. But anyway, this idea of innovation, adopting innovation as a process, there's stages people go through. There's knowledge where they become aware of that this exists, but they don't know much about it. So most people aren't even at the knowledge stage yet when it comes to MaaS. Then you have persuasion, where they've learned that this exists and it sounds interesting to them, and they start looking for information about it. Then there's the decision stage, where they start weighing the advantages and disadvantages and deciding whether to try it or not. And then, according to Rogers, the next stage is implementation, but Stromberg has broken this down into two parts, where the first is acclimatization, where you start using it and getting to know how to use it. And then you start to normalize it, where you're using the service on a regular basis and trying to fit it into your daily life and your circumstances. And then the confirmation stage where you decide, okay, does this fit well enough? Do I keep using it or do I stop using it? And innovations are evaluated based on many things. Some of them include, say, for example, the relative advantage. Do I perceive this as relatively more advantageous than my current solution? But also complexity. How difficult does it seem to adopt and use? How trialable is it? How easy is it to test? Is it observable? Do I see a lot of other people using this? Can I watch how other people are using it and learn from them or not? There are a lot of things that go into how a potential adopter evaluates innovation. And so we need to think about what we're really asking about users. I mean, in general, there's a lot of rhetoric like, well, people basically just need to stop driving so much or sell their cars. But it's a lot more complicated than that. And if we're thinking about MaaS in particular, let's think about what we're asking of MaaS users. First, they need to understand a new service concept in general, MaaS, but right now they can't watch anybody else use it. They can't try it out because it basically doesn't exist anywhere. Then they have to understand a specific manifestation of MaaS, so a specific detailed service offer where they live, say service X. Then they need to reflect on one's transport needs and use, probably for the first time, in a holistic way. I don't think many people at all, even many transportation professionals, actually know how much transport they consume and how much it costs. You need to then estimate, well, how well do I think service X may or may not match my own needs and use? Also keeping in mind that the use patterns might change after I start using the service. Then I decide, okay, do I even want to become a customer at all? Do I want to take that risk? Let alone decide how much I'm willing to pay for it. And this might also entail, in the case of a pilot or a new service, dealing with the service's growing pains. And then I have to actually try to start using it and maybe undertake behavioral change in my life. Testing new behaviors, potentially reorganizing the way I live my life, how I transport myself and my family. And then getting everybody else on board. If you're in a family, it's not just you deciding, you have to coordinate all of this with everybody else. There might be people in your family that are reluctant to undertake this process, that might be a barrier for you undertaking the process. So this adoption process, like I said, it's easily disrupted. So it's important to find ways for public actors and the service providers to support the users throughout this process. Now, there's a lot of questions about what do we actually know about MaaS and its users, and well, okay, I'm a researcher, so I always say this, but not enough. But really, I think everybody says not enough, not just researchers. And even less of what we know is actually based on empirical studies. A lot of stated preference studies out there, and I completely understand that they exist because this is interesting for people and there are limited opportunities to study it empirically. But given how complicated it is, it becomes then even more complicated to study theoretically. So we really need to change the situation, not only to encourage or facilitate gathering more empirical data, but also sharing what we learn with each other from each other's experiences and leapfrogging. Because as it's going now, we're never going to achieve this at the rate it's going. So what do we know? Well, from the innovation decision process, we know that it's really the relative advantage of an innovation that has to be considered, rather than looking at, say, specific sociodemographics or mode use characteristics. For somebody to want to use it, it has to be perceived as better somehow, proportional to its costs, including money and effort, compared to the user's current situation. And this means relative advantage differs from person to person, because everybody's in a different situation. We also know some about what users want or like or are motivated by, and some service design attributes that have proven advantageous that seem to come up repeatedly in both stated preference studies, but also the few empirical studies that are out there. People want tailored solutions to their daily challenges, or say customization. They want it to be easy to try new options, that it should be trialable, that it should provide a safe, secure, pleasant, comfortable, and convenient trip. They want MaaS to minimize stress and uncertainty. Of course, they want this of all transport, but they want it to be price-worthy, to be economically feasible for them. And they like, in general, they like that there's this bigger selection, or perceived bigger selection, or improved selection somehow. That there's a perceived improved access via MaaS, that they want that it's convenient and flexible, or they want it to be convenient and flexible, simple and easy to use. And then a lot of people, at least in this stage, but it could be because they're early adopters, a lot of people are trying it first because they're curious. But curiosity only takes you so far. The practicalities have to then take over to keep motivating you. For example, it has to be convenient and simple and improve access, etc., to keep you motivated to remain a customer.
Jana, I'm really sorry to interrupt you, but I have to keep track of time, and we really want to have enough time for questions and discussion.
Yeah, I'm just going to finish this slide and then I'm done.
Perfect, thanks.
Okay, but then on the flip side, like I said, it's about the relative advantage. So an enabler for somebody can be a barrier for somebody else because everybody's in a different situation. So kind of on the flip side, from the barrier perspective, MaaS can't be perceived as more expensive without enough other added value. It can't be perceived as more inflexible, inconvenient, or inaccessible. For example, people that are too far away from the infrastructure, or say families with many small children who need multiple car seats, it just becomes too inconvenient. It can't be perceived as too difficult to understand and use, both in terms of learning how to be a customer, to using the app, to accessing the vehicles, etc. And it can't be perceived as incomplete in some way. For example, an inadequate range of modes for the local context, or inadequate functionalities or service features. And can MaaS lead to more sustainable behavior? Yes, we've seen tendencies that it can in the some limited pilots, but as I tried to emphasize in this paper, it completely depends on the service design and the offer, as well as on changes in a wide range of public policies. For example, parking and the costs of running a car, etc. So I will round it off there and say thank you.